My name's Josh Cooperman. I host and publish Convo By Design, a podcast for the interior design and architecture space. This is our, I want to say it's our 4th or 5th year working with WestEdge. So if you've been here before, nice to see you again. If this is your first time out, welcome. Really excited about this. Convo By Design is presented by Snyder Diamond. This stage was designed by Julia Wong and Julia Wong Interiors. We're thrilled to be here. The next conversation we're having today, and by the way, just so you know, this is kind of like the anti-panel, right? If you listen to Convo By Design, or if you go download them, you can get it anywhere podcasts are available. It's free. What you'll hear is more intimate conversations, less formal in nature. So this is just kind of like us having a conversation in the living room, right? This one's called Made LA Modern. This is Dan Burnn.
Hello.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with Dan and his work, Dan founded his LA-based firm, Dan Burnn Architecture, in 2005, widely published. Dan's work includes all retail, hospitality, cultural, and residential projects. I could read the bio, but I'd rather talk it through because Dan's a really interesting guy. We were talking about sort of the aesthetic of modern in LA. You hear a lot about modern and a lot about contemporary. We're going to talk about the structure and the building of modern, but also the idea of contemporary and modern and what that means. And it's really interesting because Dan and I had a conversation before this. We were talking about this Bauhaus revival.
Right.
And that's something that's personal to you and your experience in Tel Aviv. Let's just sort of back up with the why, and then we'll get to the why now.
Perfect. So my background is actually from Tel Aviv. Was born there, raised there, moved here in the mid-'80s. I was fairly young, but a lot of people, as you mentioned, talk about Bauhaus design, modernism, and in essence, I got to live through it. And for all of you who don't know, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it has the largest amount of Bauhaus buildings in the world. So my grandparents' house, my parents' house, was what people envision today, a free open plan, sliding glass doors, terrazzo flooring, indoor, outdoor living, the same thing as everybody's kind of seeking today. I was, going day by day doing that. And then I had a big shock coming to Los Angeles, and all of a sudden, we're in this Spanish quote style, whatever house that's super dark and has no flow and no indoor-outdoor relationship. And I was like, why does this have to exist?
But what's interesting about that is, why does it have to exist? Because this is LA and that's what we do, right? We make stuff up. You come out here to reinvent yourself. You make all of your mistakes. And then you learn from it. Isn't that really what LA architecture is all about?
Absolutely. But actually, that's what gives you the opportunity to also, and why I do practice here, is because you could do anything and anything that you want to do, and the door's open for you, right? So it's completely kind of a bohemian, Wild West world, so it doesn't have the heritage.
Well, it is, and I want to touch on that because I like going from back to front, right? So we can start with where it all started and get to where we are now. I was really looking forward to this conversation. I was reminded last night, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about the dingbats. Do y'all know what the dingbats are? Have you ever seen those apartments that have the soft first story? Yeah. The soft first story? Yeah. And they're carports. Mm-hmm. And then you live over. And every time there's an earthquake, those are like the first ones that fall down because they're structurally not sound. They're not sound. Yeah. But you know what? Someone came to LA in the 50s and 60s and said, hey, what a great, look, we could put our cars underneath.
And functionally it works too, right? I mean, you take over the space, you put the car and you live right above it. It makes sense.
Yeah. So you got the dingbats, you got the googies. And when you talk modern architecture, it's hard not to talk about the googies. If you've ever driven by a Norm's, or you've seen those car washes?
I used to go to the Norms, and there used to be a Ships on La Cienega Boulevard. That was where we'd go with my dad.
And it's still there. Yeah. And it's still there. Now, some of them survive. Some of them are being torn down. There's a Chase Bank on Sunset that's a googie, and that's going away. But to your point, kind of, why does that have to exist?
I don't know. I mean, we're working right now on a project that's actually going to be net zero, right? And everybody's talking about ecologically friendly homes and the future forward of how to be conscious about anything. And people ask, well, how are you getting there? And, we live in this climate that's actually very feasible to get there. And that's why I question, why does this exist today? Like, why would somebody in their right mind hire... not a lot of people don't hire architects, but if they do, hire somebody and then end up building this palazzo-style thing that makes no sense in today's climate and environment, when you could build something that actually does make sense and you could have better living style through it.
Okay, so the next step from there, you've got minimal, you've got purposeful, you've got small. From small, you go to minimalist. Minimalist doesn't necessarily mean small, though.
No.
It doesn't.
No, I mean, minimalist could mean, you could have a huge space that's minimalist. It could be this big white box and you basically, it's a big gallery and that could be minimalist. But to me, it goes back to another principle from the Bauhaus, which is less is more, and to figure out how to be minimal in your footprint. So, there's a certain size and ethos to everything. And so to me, that's what minimalist means. And it's about editing and reducing and reducing and reducing and getting down to nothing. And if you think about it, if you've done, like your high school or college essays and you talk about a 5-paragraph essay, you have your thesis, your three paragraphs and a conclusion. The same thing goes for any good design. And so if you're able to minimalize it into nothing, and that's, to me, where architecture or design wins.
That's where it wins. And so now we've gone from macro, let's go to micro. Let's talk about flip-flop.
Right.
Tell me about the project. Tell them about the project, because I love this thing.
So actually the first residential project that I did in Los Angeles happened out of pure happenstance, and I think my career is based on that. There's a lot of things that happened. I was at the right place at the right time. And so I had just completed a showroom up in San Francisco, Bay Area, and the client wasn't hiring a photographer for this one project. And I was down here in LA with a portfolio at Sammy's camera and showing the clerk. I was renting equipment, lighting equipment. What do I need to use, blah, blah, blah. And as that was happening, my future client walked up to the counter and interrupted. And I was like, why would somebody be interrupting me right now? And I'm having this great conversation. And he turns to her and he says, hey, you're looking for an architect, meet Dan. And this is one of the reasons why I love LA. You have these great opportunities and this just can happen. And so sure enough, I flipped through some things. She says, well, what have you done before? And, showed her some things. Well, we own a piece of property on the beach in Venice, virgin land, by the way, never built on. We never even had to tear down anything. And she said, well, I'm looking to build a house with my husband, and all we really want are is a shower that has views to the outside, but you still have the privacy, and balconies that are like wrap around. So I'm like, wow, some of these language things that she describes are completely the Bauhaus, the way I grew up. And so the project was born out of just those two necessities. And then the name Flip Flop comes from, actually, if you can imagine, you have a house that's on the beach and you want to have as many views as possible, so you have to have glass, right? At the same time, you want to have privacy. And I wish we had imagery to show, and at the same time we have, they collect a lot of photos, like a gallery. And so we created these walls that essentially flip-flop, and they're pivot walls. They're 10 feet by 10 feet, and they open, and the house essentially breathes and lets air in and out, and you're able to get the views out, and at the same time have place to store art. So it solved everything, and it was just, it started DBA.
Now, this is a good time to point out, because someone's probably going to ask, you're all thinking, well, why isn't he showing us the images on the screens that are to our right and our left, right? You're nodding, you were thinking that. Because I'm a podcast producer, and I produce for audio, and because we also have a YouTube channel, and what we're doing is we film this, and then I will also be following up with videos that show exactly what Dan and I are talking about as we're talking about it, sort of like micro case studies, so that you guys can follow along when you go back and watch this on YouTube. The concept of flip-flop, love this because you juxtapose so many different concepts against each other. It's a showcase for art, but it's a personal residence. It's public in nature. I mean, it's about as public as you can get.
Yeah, and we actually tried to be more public than that. So the original idea, it has these 4 pivot walls. If you're thinking 10 feet by 10 feet, they all spin 180 degrees. The original idea was to paint the inside, and then when you flip it 180 degrees, you have art given back to the street. Being that it is in Venice and it does have that heritage of an art culture, we wanted to do that. It became prohibitively impossible due to building codes, literally, and that killed it.
What were the biggest, and I think this is important because Venice is a great example of LA in general. The rules, the regulations, as you're trying, we talk a lot about experimentation, and this is a lot of experimentation.
Well, this is a major problem.
Yeah.
Well, and we started the conversation by saying, and I said, it's the Wild West, and that's how my career really got started. It's not so much anymore, and one of my biggest hurdles is actually getting progressive architecture built in the city of Los Angeles. The building department, the planning department, the neighborhood councils, the California Commission, these are all things that really hinder progressive architecture. And they're continually trying to come up with ways to define what we can and what we can't do. And it's not necessarily beneficial to the neighborhood. And we're trying to spearhead that. But like right now, I don't think I'll ever take on another Venice project. It just doesn't happen. They just don't get realized.
Is it like childbirth? Maybe you're still a little
I don't know about childbirth.
Maybe you're still a little too close to it. Well, fair point. Fair point. I've heard about it. Maybe you're a little too close to it because when you have a canvas like that, and I mean, listen, in LA, NIMBYism it's big.
It's huge.
But it's no different than any other major metropolitan city with history.
Well, it's very litigious. And we have an amazing amount of rules that are overlapping. And actually, we have one of the worst planning codes that does exist in the nation. And part of the reason is that it's continually updated, but not rethought. We really need to remove and restart. Otherwise, the city is just going to be a disaster. And it's one of the things that actually I'm excited about LA because it is, I say it's like an onion in any city, right? So you have layers and layers and layers. And I feel like LA is only on its second peel. But if we don't get ahead of it, there's going to be even more disaster.
So interesting along those lines. Venice is obviously, Santa Monica, obviously, any beach community really is incredibly appealing because of the territory. The Hollywood Hills, very appealing. LA now, especially with the new structure that's going into Inglewood, people are talking about Compton and Inglewood in ways that we haven't.
We never imagined before, right?
Yeah. So for you, does that present an opportunity? Is that attractive to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I started my office, and it wasn't about creating homes for people. It's about creating the built environment for inhabitants, for civilians. So one of the reasons why I did choose to come back to LA is because I felt that it is an open canvas, and there's all these opportunities to support the city in a positive way. So yeah, it has nothing to do with, we don't have to find the richest neighborhoods. We have to find the neighborhoods that need our assistance in a way.
And every time you find a new neighborhood, it's going to come with its own set of challenges.
Correct.
It's going to come with its own set of issues.
Yeah. And by the way, now that I figured out Venice, I'm like, peace out, I'm out of here because I just won't touch it anymore because you can't do it. And so what's interesting is when people come to hire an architect, they ask, oh, have you ever worked in this municipality before? Do you have experience in this? You don't necessarily need to. What would be a better question is, how many different types of projects were you able to get off the ground successfully?
Okay, but wait a minute. I'm calling Behance here for a minute because here's the thing. You say, I'm not going to do it because it can't be done, but you just did it. And you did it, and wait, let me finish, and you did it remarkably well, and you finished with exactly what it is that you wanted. So it's not because it can't be done, it's because you don't want to deal with the headaches anymore, and that's fair. You as a creative, you as an artist, you can say that. It's not that it can't be done, and I say that to say this. Right. With a new territory, every new area, they're going to have their own NIMBYists.
Absolutely, there's no getting away from it. and I enjoy. Maybe my take is that I've done it 5 times in Venice, and it's kind of at this point, in order to solve the problem, it's become a formula. I need to do A, B, C, D, and here we go.
Okay,
and we're done.
See, now I get that, and that makes sense to me, because it kind of feels to me like you would be kind of setting yourself up, but selling yourself short, like it can't be done, because you did do it.
Yes, but also what's interesting is when I did do it, and not that I'm old, but when I did do it, let's say, for example, the neighborhood council saw me as an aspiring architect, or they saw me as somebody young and let's give him a shot. Now the neighborhood councils look at me like, oh, well, he's done this before and he's just a developer, even though we don't do developer style homes. But that's why I'm saying maybe somebody else new could do it. We are given the red light.
See, that I get, and I think that's really interesting. You're established.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears then from that to the Bridge House.
Yes.
Because I love this thing. And when we talk about being a piece of land is obviously the canvas for what you're creating.
Right.
And not every canvas is going to be perfect. And you're going to have things that you have to build through and over, and turning liabilities into assets. This is one of those. You built over a brook.
Yeah, turning liabilities into assets. I love that, actually, because that's as the city is becoming more and more complicated, you're not going to find that piece of flat land that's 60 by 80. Let's build, if we're talking residential, let's just build that. That's not going to happen. So in this condition, it's a piece of land that's 60 feet wide, 210 feet long, 260 feet long, and there's literally a brook running down the middle, and it's a natural brook coming from Griffith Park. It runs down underneath Highland, pops up for a few properties in this neighborhood, which is called Brookside, which is so awesome that it's actually a genuine name in a city of fakes, as we talked about at the beginning. And so literally the house is Brookside, and the house itself is 20 feet wide and approximately 210 feet long, and nobody's built anything like that there. Everybody's taken on, let's say, a 3-story house in the front of the property, and the property then looks back towards the rest. Here, I wanted to marry the built environment with the beautiful nature that we have here. So the house, no matter what room you're at, you have this connection indoor, outdoor, indoor, outdoor, indoor, outdoor.
Take me through the process of walking the property for the first time.
It was Jurassic Park. That's what it looked like to me. It felt like, well, there was somebody that lived there, and it was the second owner, and the second owner bought it after like the first year the house was built in the 40s. That was what was existing there, and nobody took care of the property. And I remember finding it, and the way I found it is I actually live across the street. The neighbor that lives next to this house invited me over, and she said, oh, you come check out our yard. And again, I'm thinking, big deal, it's the same yard as I have, it's just across the street. But all of a sudden, it gave me like one of these aha moments. I felt like a cartoon. You rub your eyes, like, what am I seeing? This can't be real. It's in the center of Los Angeles, essentially, if you think about it, like Highland and Wilshire, and all of a sudden you have 15,000 square feet of lush land with a brook running down the middle. I didn't know what to do with myself, and all I could think of was, I need to find out a way to get this property. And so I'm living across the street, and the house next to this neighbor is where Bridge House is located, and the person, I befriended the caretaker, and there you go, years down the line.
Okay, you just went from there you go, years down the line to a.
It's that simple.
It's that. Did you encounter any resistance?
No. What's interesting is that, okay, so as I'm doing this project and we're starting, originally it wasn't supposed to be a Bridge House. Originally it was supposed to be the existing house, everything looks the same from the front, adding something towards the back. And the idea was, because it's not in a historic neighborhood, Hancock Park just north of it is considered a historic preservation ordinance overlay zoning. This is not, even though now they're trying to pass that. But I still would want to mesh within my neighborhood. So next to this house, the 2 houses are about 35 feet tall on either end. And so our idea was to keep the same thing and not add to it and just go to the back. And then I was connected to a company called Bone Structure, which is the new structural system that's used to build the home, and it's really revolutionary. And it's a kit of parts. Literally, on every 5 feet, you end up with a column and a steel, and it's 90% recycled. Really, really cool, and it's all erected using just mechanical connections, no welding. So then I came up with the idea of the bridge house, and what I liked about it was that it's only 1 story tall, and so it doesn't, you can't see it from the street. Like, it's 14 feet from the street, and next to the houses that are about 35 feet tall. Now, interestingly, in terms of resistance, while I started the project, one of my Venice projects was about to get what's called an ICO, Interim Control Ordinance. An interim control ordinance is very, very, very scary for any homeowner. And this is something that a council person and a mayor could pass overnight without public votes. And it could basically mean that for any property that you own, you could essentially build a certain percentage of land. So it could be anywhere 50%, 35%, 25%. It changes. It varies by zone and by zip code. And what we were finding out is that Venice was going to get one of these ICOs. So luckily, I have some awesome clients that have great connections, and we're talking to the mayor's office. And I'm getting reassurance that the ICO is difficult to pass. And don't worry, there's nothing happening in Venice.
Famous last words.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, it's one of my biggest pet peeves, by the way. So then as I'm having this very frank conversation, I hear that, wait a minute, there might be something happening at Brookside. And I'm like, oh, no way. This is crazy. I'm starting a project. I live there. I have no notification. So I scrambled to get the permits done. And yes, lo and behold, we were ahead of the curve. But if I had not had that conversation, the whole project would have been on hold for about 18 months. And as a landowner, you're like, what? How could you even do that? So that's one thing we got through, and I'm very, very lucky. It's scary.
If you had it to do over again, what would you have done differently? Anything?
It's a very unique project in the sense that we are the developers for the project ourselves, and it's a home that's, I'm building it for myself, and I'm building it as a showpiece, and it's a way to share a story and to kind of like, okay, if everybody's familiar with the case study movement in Los Angeles, it was an idea of how to push design and building technologies forward. So that's how Bridge House is. So for every day that we're doing this and not completing the project, there's new technologies. So if I have to go back and say that I have any regrets, I don't have any regrets, and I don't have any things that I would necessarily change, but it's a consistent living organism in a way. So there's always going to be something else to add, and I always say that about design no matter what. So I let it go. So once I start design, you kind of put it in a box and say, move forward. So no, I'm completely happy with the project.
And it's funny because it's not funny, it's true. When I first saw this house, it reminded me of Waterfall. And it did because the way it's positioned, the whole house is about positioning.
Right. And
I'm interested, when you put this together, I'd like them to hear more about this too, because when we were talking about the good bones and the bone structure of this property, this house that you built, between the structure itself, the windows in particular, that you added in later, just everything that went into this, there was a great deal of forethought. And I also wanted to ask you sort of how things change. It's over a brook, which means that you have water issues.
Yes.
To be concerned about and to think through, and not just where the water goes, but where it's coming from, and how long it's going to stay there. And what if we did get rain in LA every now and then? What happens then? So I'm curious, when you approach a project like this, how did you approach it from a futurist perspective, from a bone structure, from a craftsmanship perspective?
Well, it's designed for the so-called 100-year flood. But the brook itself is 20 feet lower than ground level. Okay, so that's just not going to happen. But the reality of the biggest issue that we had is, and this is why I guess why people don't build a bridge house, or don't think about these things. But there are great benefits to what we did. But the structure to get it off the ground was insane. So it literally is built like a bridge for a highway. So we have these really large caissons, basically large columns that go into the ground on either side of the brook, and there's a span of 65 feet. So we have a 65-foot long piece of steel, which is, it's about this width of this room that we're in right now. And there's 2 of those. And the crazy thing is, as we were doing this, we did have the crazy rains. We did get stuck with the first time that there are really bad rains. And so as we're digging for these foundations, they're collapsing on themselves continually as it keeps raining. And even though you do like all the geological tests, there was more wet soil than we had anticipated to get the thing off the ground. So it was a little difficult, and it was a big challenge in just getting it started. But the benefit and the beauty of it is the fact that this design, and if you can imagine in your head, if you have a really long rectangle, and in a typical condition, you would have your home in the front portion of it. And so you would have a typical suburban resolution of front yard, home, large rear yard. And the connection between nature is obliterated in essence. All you have is windows looking out into nature, but you're not one connected to it. By taking all of that, let's say 3-story structure, smushing it down into a really long, slender piece that goes the whole length of the project, there's no more notion of front yard, rear yard. It's just nature and house. And that to me was one of the things that was really important about the project and about Bridge House. And when I actually did have a talk with Francis Sanderton on DNA on NPR, and that was one of the things that I mentioned was that in LA, the architecture scene just needs to think about this more. And we need to have even our developers, our architects, homeowners, instead of just, hey, let's plop on whatever we want to do, we have to think about how is the land used. And in this case, there's it wouldn't be seen as a developer wouldn't necessarily have gravitated towards that solution, even though that solution works the best in that condition.
Doesn't that kind of go back to the original concept that we were talking about LA and experimentation? When Dan and I were talking before, one of the stories that comes to mind is Wallace Neff and the concept of the bubble house. If you're not familiar, World War II, you got all these GIs who were coming back to Southern California. Wallace Neff, who builds these large, luxurious, grand structures, wants to solve a social issue because there's a housing crisis. Sounds familiar, right? So there's a housing crisis. So he thinks, let's do this. Here's an idea for a new concept. We're going to basically turn a swimming pool upside down. We're gonna sheet it in metal.
Right.
We're gonna gunite it. We're gonna create a house out of it. He thought this is brilliant. I'm gonna make 300, 400,000 of these homes. Wound up making 25,000 of them, and he died in the last one. It's still in Pasadena.
Correct.
They're hideous. They look like burritos. That's what they look like. But it's a good idea. It's modern. It's not wasteful. What's the difference between brilliance and a burrito in Pasadena?
Well, it does answer to a question. And I think that's what intrigues me about architecture and design in general. It's there's a problem and there's a solution, and how do we come up with the perfect marriage of the two? And maybe that idea should have been, it didn't work out aesthetically as best it could have. And maybe it's a condition of, taking the engineering mind and figuring it out together with an architect who could put it together and process it in a way that we can actually accept, which is really important. But the case study movement was the same thing, and, we have these celebrated homes by Pierre Koenig, up in the Hollywood Hills, and it's a small home by today's standard. It's less than 1,500 square feet, 1,200 square feet. When we see it right now, when we see the photos of it, people assume that was a luxury home because right now there are luxury homes there. It was not designed as a luxury home at all. It was designed as a GI solution to a problem. And we're not thinking about these things. And I remember actually, even when I was in undergrad, we were given a project, and it was out close to when the Red Line was starting to get built. And the idea was to build, it was a multi-family unit that we were supposed to design. It was what's called integrative studio, and where you start to finally figure out about structures, mechanicals, all of that. And we were tasked to design apartment buildings. And it was one block south of one of these, what do you call it, subway stations. And LA is so strange is because you have a main artery, a corridor, let's say Wilshire, and you go one block south and it's all of a sudden suburban, and it's bizarre. And so my thought was, why are we taking these amazing street corners, de-densifying them, and we have all these conditions where you have these L-shaped mini malls, right? And they're just like kind of open, one story. And we need to think about a way to actually condense and figure out to have a multi-use function. And my idea was, okay, well, our lot was behind the mini mall, and we were supposed to build 50 units there. I thought, well, you have this L-shaped mini mall, why not build on top of it? And so my idea was to create a structure, a superstructure, a steel structure that would basically clamp on top of, let's say, we have your 7-Eleven and all that stuff, and you have your proposed metro stop. Build on top of it, and then the area behind it that was supposed to be the housing could become park, right? And we have to think about these conditions. But in order to solve these problems, we need to also have a city that's open to accept these conditions.
Totally agree. And it's funny, one constant, and it doesn't really matter who you talk to in the industry, everyone agrees that the system is flawed.
Completely.
And we're certainly not going to fix that here. But I will tell you one thing. Every year, I do go to the County of Los Angeles, and I talk to them about the state of architecture and the state of residential housing in Los Angeles. They've actually done, with these historical POVs, they've done a lot to sort of quantify and qualify what's where, how to save what's worthy of being saved. I think the point is that they're starting to. Last question I had for you, and I just sort of wanted to cover this. Your philosophy on, your quote was, excited for not having waste. And I like the idea that the way you work is to minimize the amount of waste in the process. And I think that sort of checks off so many boxes. Sustainability, yes. Using what you need, not what you're capable of putting there, and making it so that it is sustainable, it is valuable, it is exactly what you want it to be, but only what you want it to be.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, and again, we go back to where I grew up and how it all got started in a way. Growing up in Tel Aviv, utilities were very expensive. You can understand, So to take a hot shower, you actually didn't heat the water through your typical means. We would have on the roof, you would have literally your big, 50 gallons of water, but then it would just travel along a plate. Imagine like a serpentine tube going back and forth over a black paint. That's it. Very, very, very simple. You would flip a switch, it would open up the valve, and the water would fall down, and it would get heated by that point. And you'd have your 15 minutes of fame, 15 minutes of shower time, and that's it. And so I grew up with that in mind, okay? So I always think that resources are not abundant, and what can we do? So one of the things that I do in my firm in order to simplify, for example, when you work with a material, okay, let's say you have a slab of Caesar stone, a countertop, very simple. It could come in 4x10 sheets, 4x8 sheets, 5x10, whatever it is. We don't do, we'll have the powder room in gray, we'll have this room in pink, and we'll have this room in that. Every time you do that as a designer, an architect, homeowner, whatever you do, that's waste. Because you're still buying the raw material in a full-size sheet. So if you could think about how you actually do that when you're designing, that's incredibly resourceful. So literally on every project that we do, we have a layout of the materials that we work with and how they're going to be used in there. And with Bridge House, it goes to an extreme because it was built using a system and a kit of parts. And it's not a prefab home and it's not a modular home, but it's a new system of parts. The raw material that's supplied there stayed there. There was we didn't have trash bins, we didn't have anything taken away from it. So in a typical construction, again, it goes back to, let's say, a 4x8 sheet of plywood. You have work people on site who cut that down into a 4x4, whatever. Here, everything showed up that size, ready to drill, ready to install, ready to go. And we still have, and I was talking to another friend of mine who's a product designer, why do we use drywall still? And I need to think about that, and that will be like my next like resource question, because that's extremely wasteful, and it's a bad resource.
Just a quick follow-up. When you think about Bridge House, is that something that you would ever consider? You said it's not a kit of parts, but would you ever consider that being sort of a modular model? I mean, modular has such a bad connotation, right? It really it does, because it says it's not custom at all. But is that something that you think about? Absolutely.
For me, I take that connotation exactly. When we talk about Bridge House, I make sure that people don't say modular home or don't say prefab home, because it has that connotation. So the biggest challenge was when the company Bone Structure approached us was, can it still be DBA? Can it still be our own ethos? And if not only can it, will it be better? And it has become better because of that. And that's and it solved a lot of problems. And it got us to think about architecture differently, and to be way more cognizant about our built world and net zero and green technologies. So I do look forward to using this system again, though I also say that this system is not going to answer every single problem in every single site. So we are very much site specific. So I'm not, closing my doors on any given point.
Totally. Way to answer the question exactly on both sides of it. It's perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, you guys. Thanks for joining us today. You got a lot of places that you could be, but thank you for coming here to sit with us for a while. I just want to remind you, Convo by Design, everywhere you get your podcasts, it's free. We're going to start loading up these conversations. So if you missed any part of it, or you just want to go back, hear it again, or download it, send it to someone you love, you can do that too. I'm Josh Cooperman with Convo by Design. We are presented by Snyder Diamond. The space was designed by Julia Wong. And I would very much like to thank my guest, Dan Burnn.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Take care.